So I'm going to talk about the Battle of Monocacy. The actual battle took place on the 9th of July 1864, but I'm actually going to talk about the campaign before and after. It's really important to set in context. And as Mike said, and as Frank said, it doesn't exist in isolation. This is an attempt to try and relieve the pressure on what's going on further south. It's a small battle, about 20,000 participants, and about 20,000 participants and about 2,000 casualties. The right thing, how this works. So, strategic situation, we've discussed at length what's going on down in the Richmond-Petersburg area, and we've got Hunter in the valley. On the 12th of June 1864, Lee gives Jubal Early, who is now in command of the 2nd Corps, with Ewell out of action, a set of orders to get on with this ready. And I'll read you from Early's memoirs, which sort of traces what the orders said. To hold the corps with 2 of the battalions of artillery attached to it, in readiness to move to Shenandoah Valley. By the way of Louisa Courthouse, Charlottesville, and through Browns or Swift Run Gap in the Blue Ridge, as I might find most advisable. To strike Hunter's force in the rear, and if possible, destroy it, then move down the valley, cross the Potomac near Leesburg to Loudoun County, or at or above Harper's Ferry, as I might find most practicable. To threaten Washington City. I was further directed to communicate with General Breckinridge, who would cooperate with me in the attack on Hunter and the expedition into Merida. So quite clear articulation of what he thinks the mission is, and actually divided there's sort of 4 missions. Firstly, to clear the Shenandoah Valley, the breadbasket of the Confederacy, get Hunter out, which is being a bit of a nuisance, and give that back to the Confederacy. Secondly, to distract Union forces from Petersburg. Hopefully by attacking Washington, you're going to force the Union to draw troops away from the south to the north. To raid Washington, if practicable, good old Lee wording there, which gives a lot of leeway to his subordinate commanders. And a final mission, which I'm not going to cover, but actually it's part of his overall campaign, in fact, you have the questions if you want to, is to release prisoners from Point Lookout. There's nearly 20,000 Confederate prisoners in Point Lookout, and there's a prisoner of war camp there. And rather fancifully, there is a thought about relieving the prisoners from there, but not really pertinent to one we talk about at the moment. So, Early, I'm sure you all know about Early, born in 1816, attends West Point in 1833, passes out 18th of 50 graduating students, fights in the Seven Indian Wars, then retires to become a lawyer, comes back into the army for the Mexican War, and then goes back to lawyering and joins up as a volunteer at the start of the Civil War. Often described as outspoken, caustic, opinionated, a great swearer with imaginatively profound speech. So a hard fighting, hard drinking, hard swearing soldier, but fundamentally a reasonably good commander. So Early sets off to attack Hunter at Lynchburg, where in 2 days of fighting on the 17th and 18th of June, he defeats Hunter and sends him off to the southwest. He escapes over the Blue Ridge Mountains, and on the 3rd of June, Early gives up chasing Hunter and decides to head up the valley. He wrote to Lee there or thereabouts, "I've decided to turn down the valley and proceed according to your instructions to threaten Washington, and if I find an opportunity, to take it." So there he heads off down the valley. Now, his force, which he renames as he heads off up the valley, is called the Confederate Army of the Valley District. And it's essentially his corps, so that's here, Rhodes and Ramsey's divisions, with associated artillery under Long and cavalry under Ransom. And he's also then got Breckinridge's corps with Breckinridge's division, now commanded by Eccles, and Gordon's division, who we heard about earlier on today. Not that it affects this particular campaign a great deal, but as we know, Early and Gordon don't particularly get on after the incident in the wilderness. So they continue through the valley. They arrive in Winchester on the 2nd of July, and after plundering the federal stores at Harper's Ferry on the 4th of July, they cross the Potomac into Maryland, and on the 5th of July, they overnight on the former battlefield of Antietam, Sharpsburg, depending what side you're on. Now, they've been heading off down here, keeping themselves to themselves, but intelligence on this movement has been provided for on or around the 29th of June, principally by this chap. Do you know who this is? This is John W. Garrett, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Indeed, fancies himself there. But he has a network of telegraph stations along the railway, and he uses those to pass back information. Now, the first message he sends back to Iain Standen, the Secretary of State for War, is the enemy has appeared in force at Duffield, 6 miles west of Harper's Ferry. Now, he's not just doing this out of duty, he also has skin in the game. This is a picture of Monocacy Junction, which I'll talk about more in detail later on, but important things to note are there's a railway bridge here that has been destroyed. This is a picture post the Antietam campaign of 1862, where the railway bridge here, a fairly substantial railway bridge, was destroyed by the Confederate forces. And it cost Garrett $11,000 to repair it. So he's got skin in the game in terms of money, and therefore very keen that the Union Army protects the railroad and therefore starts to provide this information. Halleck gets notification on the 1st of July, informs Grant that there are rebel forces in the Shenandoah Valley. Grant replies that Early's corps was still at Petersburg, and he reasserted the same 2 days later. Now, Garrett knows different because his chaps are watching them coming up the valley and reporting back. So, on around the 2nd of July, he goes and visits this chap. You know who this is? Lew Wallace. Lew Wallace, born in 1827, at the start of the war, is a unit commander. He rises to the rank of brigadier in September '61, and then in '62 he takes part in the Fort Donelson campaign, where he's promoted to Major General, the youngest in the Union Army at the age of 34. He then has a rather unfortunate incident about the Shiloh, where he's late. He misses the battle really, and this puts him on Grant's bad books. He's removed, and at the time of the Battle of Monocacy, before Battle of Monocacy, he is in command of the Middle Department and the 8th Corps, which is in around the sort of Baltimore, Maryland area. And it's essentially a political job. He's there to keep the Baltimore influence happy. So when Garrett comes to him and says, bless you, comes to you and says, the Confederates are heading up the valley, and what are you going to do about it? Wallace sees this as an opportunity to resurrect his career and his reputation. And very early on in this small campaign, he spots the importance of Monocacy Junction. Indeed, we know this because he gave very specific orders on the 3rd of July to one of his subordinates, which says, if necessary, push any other available troops towards Monocacy Junction. So he's already identified this piece of ground as an important place, both in terms of defence, but also probably in terms of Early's advance. So on the night of the 4th or 5th of July, Wallace himself deploys from the Washington area out to Monocacy. Now, in the meantime, Early is bringing the hard and, as you'll see in a very moment, slightly incompetent hand of the Confederacy to the Maryland area. On the 6th of July, Early's cavalry and the McCausland ride into the town of Hagerstown, and there McCausland presents a written demand for $20,000 and a range of supplies. If they don't provide that money and supplies, then he threatens to burn the town. They're given 3 hours to raise the money and the supplies, which they do. The incompetence is the fact that Early had told him to ask for $200,000, but he drafted the ransom note incorrectly and put $20,000. So anyway, after receiving $20,000 and supplies, McCausland moves on. The Confederates continue to move forward. We see Hagerstown, which is a slight detour to go to the ransom. Wallace is now just outside Frederick, where Monocacy is. And Garrett is still continuing to provide intelligence. On the 3rd of July reports there are indications of the advance of the enemy down the valley, and that his cavalry met ours at Winchester. Later he asked, can you make such movements as to prevent the success of the enemy? Standen then responds, the great difficulty is to know the exact truth and avoid being misled by stampede and groundless clamour, or being surprised by real danger. If you have any sources of truthful information, you had better resort to them. So clearly his reports aren't getting traction in Washington. On the 4th of July, Garrett reports to Stanton and the Chief of Staff of the Army, Henry Hollick, to pass some reports from the garrison in Harper's Ferry. And on the 5th, telegraphs both Lincoln and Stanton. On the 5th, having been bombarded with intelligence, there starts to be a wake-up in Washington that might actually be something going on here. So Grant finally admits that Early is probably not down south, and this is probably good information. Therefore, he orders Lee to send the division forward. And in the early hours of the 6th of July, Ricketts' 3rd Division of Wright's 6th Corps, some 4,000 men, are ordered forward to support Wallace. They embark at City Point on the morning of the 6th of July and head to Baltimore with other troops from the 6th Corps also being embarked and destined for the defence of Washington. So you can see there here two seaboard movements, one up here to Baltimore and up to the other up here to Washington. Now Wallace's force at Monocacy will ultimately consist of these troops here. The 1st and 2nd Brigade, the 1st Separate Brigade under Tyler, and cavalry under Clendenin here. Oops, sorry. These two here. Tyler is a veteran brigade commander, served as brigade commander at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, and he's currently commanding the defences of Baltimore, and so he's tasked directly to help Wallace. Clendenin, again, a very capable cavalry commander who provides Wallace with vital intelligence, as cavalry should do, and head of the force as Early starts to approach. Now, those two organisations are very much scratch forces. Tyler's particularly consisting of National Guardsmen, but as Grant sends his troops forward, they are reinforced by Ricketts' 3rd Division, which has got Truex's brigade and McClellan's brigade, both of whom are good, hardened veteran troops. So again, helps the morale of this whole force, the fact they've got some proper veteran troops coming in to help them. Ricketts himself is a West Point officer, an artillery officer, Mexican War veteran. As you probably know, he manned a battery at Manassas. He's wounded at Manassas, he's taken prisoner and then paroled. He's promoted to Brigadier General, and he's also injured at Antietam. He's later wounded in the Shenandoah campaign and still survived. So he's a bit of a hard man. Now, continue forward. Clendenin's cavalry are forward of the Nazi position. They're up here. And on the 7th of July, the Confederates move into the town of Middletown, which is a little bit to the west of Fredericksburg. And there they institute another ransom. This time they're asking for $5,000 only, but a lot of supplies, 8,000 rations for all the troops here. Starts off with small demand, and as senior commanders in the cavalry arrive, the volume of ransom goes up and up. The next day, Early himself arrives in the vicinity. On the 9th of July, as his troops are heading to the battlefield, he turns up in the town of Frederick. And here is a sketch by a chap called Charles Reed, which recalls the event. Early turns up, he asks for another $200,000 and a range of rations, including sugar, coffee, salt, bacon, or he burned the town. The board of aldermen of the town and town council decide they're going to borrow the money to pay for this ransom from the town's banks. And they tell the banks they're going to pay this money back when they can, and indeed they do. The first half of the debt is repaid in 1868. But the final payment, this is what I found fascinating, the final payment of this ransom was not paid until the 29th of September 1951. So banks have long memories.
With or without interest?
Good question, Danny. Anyway, having sort of plundered the Maryland countryside, Early moves on. And he's heading towards battlefield of Monocacy. So just to orientate you to the ground, town of Frederick here, this is the Monocacy River running through the middle here. And that empties into the Potomac about 10 miles to the south. There are a number of crossing points in this river, and we discussed earlier about rivers and what have you being obstacles. Like any river, this is an obstacle to Civil War troops. So the crossings are important. In the north, there's a jug bridge. Across the whole length of the battlefield here, we have a number of fords. Some are more useful than others. And in the centre, we have two crossings in the middle here. First is the railway bridge. This is a contemporary sketch by Alfred Ward, the British war artist, which shows the bridge as it was. So this is rebuilt after the original picture I showed you. That 40-foot high, just planks and railway lines on it. So no footway on there, which becomes significant later on. In the middle, a covered bridge. Those who don't know what covered bridge looks like, this is a typical covered bridge. It's the one in place called Means Bottom in Virginia. So a bridge with cover on the top of it, made out of wood. In the centre here, the Worthington House. This is a contemporary picture, but pretty much looks like it was. At the time of the battle, this was the home of the Worthington family. Nothing clever about the name of the house there. Including a chap called Glenn, who was 6 years old at the time of the battle and witnessed it, and would later write, for many years, was the definitive history of the Battle of Monocacy. In the middle here, the Best Farm. This is a picture of the Best Farm taken from the sort of northeast, looking across to the Worthington Farm, which sits on the top here. Again, this has been restored by the National Park, and during the battle provided a place where Confederate snipers were located until flushed out by the Union artillery. The red vegetation at the time, as you can see, unlike the wilderness, this is farmland. So at the time, there were crops in the field, probably about waist, chest height in some cases. So again, quite good for concealment and concealing movement of troops in places. The other side, this field was the place where, in 1862, the special order was found. So, like many Civil War battlefields, you come back to the same place again and again and again. So, the morning of Saturday, the 9th of July, the two armies were on a collision course here. Wallace had given himself missions, objectives, which were very simple. First, to make the enemy develop his force. Again, Chris talked about developing forces with cavalry, and Tony and Eric there. The purpose here was to get the Confederates to deploy, which would, one, allow you to work out who they were, what strength, what have you, but also to slow them down. Secondly, Wallace wanted to know what their intentions were, so which direction they were going. It's still unclear whether they were heading Baltimore direction or Washington direction. So again, the second thing was to try and find how they were deployed. And third, having found out what their intentions were and force them to disclose their force, was to try and delay them here as long as possible to allow the reinforcements that were coming up to Washington to get into place. So, after a rainy night on Saturday, the Saturday the 9th of July dawned with what looked to be a bright day. John Warsman, a Confederate soldier, recalled, "It was a beautiful day in this beautiful country. The sun was bright and hot, and a nice breeze was blowing, which kept us from being too warm." Wallace's combined force was numbering about 5,800 troops, and they were spread all around the junction and the right side of the river. So you had troops up in the area of the jug bridge and the forts here, troops around here, and troops down here. Particular note are two blockhouses here and here, either side of the river, which defended the run. Now the battle divides neatly into 4 phases, and I'll run through each of those 4 phases at a time. Firstly, 8 o'clock in the morning until midday. The main attack by the Confederate forces begins around 8 o'clock in the morning, as Stephen Dawson Ramser's division starts to make attack straight towards the main central position here. There's a line of Union skirmishers out the front, made up of troops from the 9th New York, 10th Vermont, 1st Maryland, and 106th New York. And this first attack forces them to draw back to just north of the railway here. In the north, Rhodes Division attacks and again pushes the skirmishers that the Union deployed back towards the river. In the south, having seen the positions now, seeing where the Union forces are deployed, Early decides very quickly not to have a major attack in the centre until he's done something to turn the flank. So he sends Corstland here, cavalry commander, down to try and explore the crossing here to see if he can get over and turn the Union left flank. So the Corstland's troops cross Monocacy behind Worthing farmhouse about 10:30 in the morning, where they encounter B Company of 8th Illinois Cavalry, who put up stiff resistance, but the Corstland's brigade overwhelmed them and pushed them back. Corstland's troops, having crossed the river, advanced towards the Worthington house and picking up cavalry tactics, unlike the examples we've heard today, where 1 in 4 hold the horses. They're told to tie their horses to fences, to trees, and the whole of his force are deployed forward for an attack. So the Corstland's forces are here, they've tied their horses up, and they approach the Union line here. Deployed here are Ricketts pickets. And as the Corstland's troops move forward, they get within 125 yards. Ricketts pickets are behind the fences, and at the end, 100 yards out, they get up, stand up on the fence, and fire off a volley. Catches Corstland's troops by surprise. A very quick exchange of fire takes place, but the Corstland's troops are forced back. So first blood to the Union. In the centre, about 11 o'clock, Ramseur launches a second attack. A fierce battle ensues, but the skirmish line here holds its position. And whilst Ramseur is supported by artillery here, deployed far forward towards the Best House, Union artillery from this side starts to return fire as an artillery duel goes on. In the north, Rhodes continues to move forward, but the line of pickets of skirmishers here continues to hold. At about midday, with the July sun high in the sky, things are getting a bit warm. But as a result of Ramseur pushing these skirmishers back here, Wallace starts to get worried about the bridge in the middle, and he decides he's going to burn the wooden covered bridge. Which indeed he does. This great picture by Keith Rocco shows that happening. The only unfortunate thing about that is the skirmish line is still to the north of the river. It hasn't brought them back. So we've got skirmish line north of the river, cut off, but still fighting its corner. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Corstland's troops have reorganised. As I said, they pulled back to Wilmington Farm and they're told to go in again, this time to try and turn the left flank. So having gone forward, they saw where the left flank was, so they start to move down here towards the Thomas Farm. And they get to Thomas Farm, they manage to get into it, but just at the right moment, Ricketts sends forward Truex Brigade to knock them back out. And again, quoting from the OR, it says, Truex men advancing, gallant style, driving the enemy from before them and occupying the Thomas house. So they're pushed back and the left flank is regained. Early then picks up the story in his memoirs. Gordon was then ordered to move forward and strike the enemy on his left, drive him from the commanding position, drive him from the positions commanding the crossings in Ramsar's front, as to enable the latter to cross. The movement was executed under the personal supervision of General Breckinridge, and while Ramsar skirmished with the enemy in front. So you've got Ramsar skirmishing here, Causton is testing the left flank, and Gordon is told to go forward here across the river. So Causton is distracting the Union forces while Gordon crosses over. By that 2:30, 3 o'clock, Gordon has crossed, and he decides to launch an attack of his 3 brigades in echelon. From the south, Terry's, from south, Evans, then York's, and then Terry's. Evans is launched at about 3:30, and I'll read some of the accounts of people who took part in it. So, the commander of one of the regiments, the 10th Vermont, Colonel William Henry, says he saw the Confederates coming and said, "Wait, boys, don't fire until you see the CSA on their waist belts, and then give it to them." A veteran recalled that as the Confederates reached the fence line in front of the Union position, the command rang out, "Fire!" and then fire at will. Brigadier General Zuban York recalled this was the fiercest and bloodiest combat his command had been involved in, considering the numbers engaged. The Confederates took casualties, but gradually the attack started to push the Union forces back. Again, Early picks up the story in his memoirs. The attack was made by Gordon in gallant style, and with the aid of several pieces of King's artillery, which had crossed the river, and Nelson's artillery from the opposite side, he threw the enemy into great confusion and forced him from his position. In the north, Tyler continued to hold off roads in conjunction with Gordon's attack. 1530, Ramsar launched a final attack in the centre. So by 1600, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederates had started to gain ground. In the south here, Gordon is pushing them back. In the north, Ramsar's troops are forcing pressure on the skirmish line, and in the north, Rhodes is forcing the troops here to retreat back across the river. So with the Colour Bridge burnt down, this skirmish line at the front here had to find a way across. So they made their way across the railway bridge, which I said earlier is just the railway line on sleepers, so not terribly good to get across. But the man in charge of this was a chap called Georgie Davis, first lieutenant of the Company D of the 10th Vermont, and he was in charge of the forward skirmish line. And he takes up the story. I was sent by General Waters' headquarters for orders, which were to hold the 2 bridges across the river at all hazards, prevent the enemy from crossing. I knew nothing of the situation or the plan of battle except as apparent to the eye. The natural advantages of cover and position were in our favour. In the early part of the noon attack, the wooden bridge over the Monocacy River was burned without notice to me. I received no orders from any source after the first gun was fired in the morning. Being only a first lieutenant, it was a new experience to be thus suddenly thrown into such a responsible position, where authority must be used and great risk taken. He then talks about retreating. This is one of Rocco's pictures of the bridge and the Vermont troops. A noble band of Vermonters stood by me until I gave the order to retreat. Then we kept together and crossed the railroad bridge, stepping upon ties, there being no floor. The enemy were at our heels, and before we could get away from the bridge, had laid violent hands upon 5 of my own company close around me and taken them prisoners. As a result of his work here, Davis is awarded the Medal of Honour. His citation reads, while in command of a small force, he held the approaches to 2 bridges against repeated assault of superior numbers, thereby materially delaying early's advance on Washington. The second Medal of Honour was also awarded to this chap, called Alexander Scott, who volunteered for the 10th Vermont at the start of the war, was promoted to corporal and assigned to the colour party. At Monocacy, he was decorated for, and I quote, under a very heavy fire of the enemy, saved the national flag of his regiment from capture. So by 7 o'clock in the evening, the Union are in full retreat, and they head back towards to Baltimore. The Union losses were about 1,194 dead, wounded, captured, about 22% of their force. Confederate losses were somewhere between 700 and 900, so about 6% of their force. But crucially, Wallace's action here had bought a day's worth of time for those reinforcements to come up to Washington. The next morning, the Confederates marched on, and by midday on the 11th of July, Early stood in the outskirts of DC, looking at the earthworks of Fort Stevens, one of the forts ringing Washington. And here's a picture taken during the Civil War. I think it's taken just after the Battle of Monocacy, which shows Fort Stevens. Has anybody been to Fort Stevens? Yeah. One of the forts that's been sort of preserved there. You can get the general feel of it. Considerably more development around the outside of this fort than there was in this picture. Early makes some attempts to attack the fort on the 11th and 12th of July, but really doesn't get very far. This picture here, which hangs in the superintendent's office of the National Cemetery, which is close by to here, shows Lincoln standing on the parapet watching the action going on. And there's an apocryphal story that the future Supreme Court Judge, Wendell Holmes, says to him at one point, "Get down, you damn fool." He's standing there putting himself in the firing line. Having failed to break into Washington, Early draws back across into the Shenandoah Valley. So, what did the commanders at the time think about this battle? I've got sort of 3 quotes here. Early, in his report on this campaign, says, "Some of the northern papers stated that between Saturday and Monday, I could have entered the city. But on Saturday, I was fighting at Monocacy, 35 miles from Washington, a force that I could not leave in my rear, and after disposing of that force and moving as rapidly as possible for me to move, I did not arrive in front of the fortifications until noon on Monday, and then my troops were exhausted." Grant, in his memoir, says, bearing in mind this is a chap who had an antagonistic relationship with Wallace, and says in his memoirs, "If Early had been but 1 day earlier, he might have entered the capital before the arrival of reinforcements by 7. General Wallace contributed on this occasion by the defeat of the troops under him a greater benefit to the cause than often falls to other commanders of a equal force to render by means of a victory." And Wallace himself later ordered the gathering up of the bodies of Monocacy, and he posed a memorial of the battle which says, "These men died saving the national capital," and they did save it. Now, how do we assess this battle? First of all, look at the facts. Wallace, against his own mission, Wallace was able to determine the size of Early's force and pass that information back. He was also able to determine his direction of travel and objectives, and fighting this battle, he slowed down Early so that reinforcements could reach the city. And by the time Early himself reached DC and confronted those defences, there were sufficient troops deployed to stop him getting in. So on that basis, you could certainly say he saved the capital. There are lots of counterfactual arguments you could have around this, and for example, okay, if Wallace hadn't achieved his aim of slowing them down, would it have made a difference? Would Early have got to the city? Would he have reached those reinforcements somewhere else? Would the Battle of Monocacy actually fought in the streets of Washington? There's so many counterfactuals here, but from the facts, he most definitely did slow him down, and 40 days time. After the war, or after the battle, Wallace, I'm sure you all read about Wallace, he was actually initially removed from command because he'd lost the battle. But actually when the full reports came in and evidence of what he did, he was reinstated to the job. He then went on to be one of the members of the commission looking at the Lincoln conspirators, and also then headed up the commission that looked at Henry Verse, the commandant of Andersonville, and convicted him. After the war, he goes into diplomacy, has a number of jobs on behalf of government around the world, and then for what he's most famous for is, as well as being Greg's dad. Was it granddad? Is writing then and there. Early, again, I'm sure we all know early. At the end of the war, he escapes Mexico, starts writing his memoirs, of which there are a number of different versions. It's very interesting to track Early's writings about this particular battle through the initial post-action reports, a subsequent one a year later, and then through various of his memoirs. But he's probably most famous to us all, I think, as one of the architects of the lost cause. The battlefield itself, in the decades after the battle, it was memorialised, as many Civil War battles are. In 1908, Pennsylvania Memorial was raised. 1915, the Vermont Memorial here. In 1907, the New Jersey Memorial here. And then in 1914, the Confederate Memorial here, and the centenary of the battle, the Maryland Memorial here, which commemorates both Union and Confederate forces. The battlefield itself has a sort of bit of a checkered history. In 1928, Glenn Worthington, who was still on the battlefield, owned a large portion of it. This picture again by Rocco shows Worthington during the battle, looking out from his house, the Worthington farm, on the troops coming past. He was one of the people instrumental in terms of trying to create a memorial park here. And although there was a bill passed in 1934 to secure the battlefield, it wasn't until the late 70s that money was actually allocated to do exactly that. And it eventually passed into the hands of the National Park Service. We now have, as you see back here, a nice visitor centre and mark it all out. The Thomas Farm was acquired in 2001. The preservationists didn't get all their own way in the 1960s and 80s, big battles with highways. The I-270, which runs right to the battlefield, was put in there in the 60s and then widened in the 80s. If you've been to the battlefield, it's a little bit of an eyesore right through the centre of the battlefield. But in 2013, the Preservation Maryland placed the battlefield on its list of historic properties, and the National Park now have interpretation throughout the park, walks, etc., etc. For those who have not been, here it is. So if you're going to Gettysburg from DC, it's just a small hop off the motorway there. And as I said, it has now a proper battlefield park with a visitor centre, hikes, hiking trails, and what have you around the park. And well worth a visit if you've got a sort of spare couple of hours on the trip there. So, why should we care about Monocacy? Well, first of all, I think it's a relatively small action, but actually has potentially strategic consequences. In the context of what I'm speaking today, it's towards the end of the war, where the Union victory looks almost inevitable, yet it has the ability to create a threat on Washington. And Early is quoted as saying that when one of his soldiers said, "We failed," he said, "Major, we haven't taken Washington, but we scared Abe Lincoln like hell." So there was still creating a threat. Thirdly, it sort of recovers Wallace's reputation. His loss of reputation at Shiloh is up for discussion, so this certainly sort of cements his reputation. And lastly, why should we care about it? I hope you find this an interesting story that we